If we want to begin an example of Microsoft Excel's if function, the first thing we're going to do is copy our worksheet. Anytime we're given the option, we want to make sure that we copy our source data. That way, if we make a mistake, we can always go back to the original data. So I'm going to right click on this tab. I'm going to select copy, create a copy, and I'm going to move it to the end. Once we hit OK, you'll see that the new tab exists, and it shows a 2 here because there are 2 of these that have been named Original No Edit. So I'm going to rename this worksheet. Right click, then select Rename. And I'm going to rename it if function. Now that we have it renamed, we can see our data. And I'm going to work in a new column. So I'm going to hold down Control and hit the right arrow to get us to the end of that contiguous data. And we're going to work in column P. And I'm going to rename column P if sales. And what we're going to try to do is create an if function that's going to give us a different value based on what is in our sales column. So over here in column J, we see sales. And I'm just going to auto fit that column by hitting Alt-H-O-I. And it will auto fit it to the cell that I'm in. Now I'm going to select the data that's in this column because I want to format it to make it a little easier for me to read. So in this case, I'm going to hold down Control, Shift, and the down arrow, and it's going to highlight all contiguous rows. There's another way to do this. We go back to cell J2. I can have J2 activated, hold down the Shift key, and then select the last cell that I want. And so in this case, when I hold down Shift and I left click, it will highlight that same set of rows. And what I want to do now is format those cells. In this case, I'm going to go to currency. And again, because we've added decimal points, it makes it more difficult to read. So we'll auto fit these rows as well. And it makes it a little easier to read the value of these sales figures for each of these companies. Now that we can read them better, I'm going to go back over to column P. And what I want to do is provide a value that if sales are above $1 billion, we have the value that's in column J. And if it's less than 1 billion, I want it to read the text that says less than 1 billion. So the first thing we'll do is go to cell P2 and type in our if function. And what we see is that if is going to check whether a condition is met and returns one value of true and another value of false. The first thing that's going to do is create a logical test. And what we're trying to test here is whether or not cell J2 is greater than $1 billion. And if I hit a comma, you'll see that we'll move in the formula to value of true. And what we want to do is if it is greater than $1 billion, we want to have it equal that value that's in the cell. So I'm going to type J2. And let's see what happens when we do that. It gives us the same value that's in cell J2. If I change the format to currency, we'll see how clear that is. And so that's part of the if function. But now I want to give it a value if it's false, because I'm going to drag this function to where it's going to be used for all of the cells in column J. And so in order to edit the formula, I'm going to hit F2. And that allows me to go in and edit the formula as I need to. So now I want a value if it's false. And I want it to say less than 1 billion. And so let's try this. You'll notice that it gives us an error. And the reason that it gives us an error is that Excel doesn't know what to do with that less than 1 billion comment. So what we need to do if we're going to work with text inside a formula, we need to use quotation marks. So I'm going to go in and edit this formula and add quotation marks so that if cell J2 is less than $1 billion, it will read the text less than 1 billion. Now we can drag this formula down. There are two ways to do this. We can use the fill handle and just fill it in, or, and I use Control Z there to undo that, or because this cell is next to a column with data, if we were to double click on this fill handle, it will fill this formula all the way down to the end of this contiguous data. And you'll see that it filled it in. And so what we have here is that for every figure that's in J2, if it's greater than 1 billion, it gives us that value. If we go to cell P6, we'll notice that in cell J6, that is less than $1 billion, and so it reads the text of less than $1 billion, which is exactly what we're trying to do in our formula. So that's fairly straightforward. If we wanted to use calculations and if functions, we can as well. So let's go to cell Q1, and we'll name this column dividends paid. And in order to calculate our dividends paid, one way to do that is to take our net income and multiply it by our payout ratio. So dividends paid for a corporation is a function of the net income and the payout ratio. And in this case, we'll make up an example, but let's say I want to report the dividends paid if the company pays more than 10% of its net income out as dividends. And so I can begin this formula by typing equals, and then we want to choose our if function. And the first thing we need to do is have a logical test. And in this case, we said our test is going to be that if cell L2 is greater than 0.10, if that is true, then I want to see dividends paid. And in this case, we can use a calculation for this portion of this formula. And so if it is true, then I want Excel to take the value in K2 and multiply it by the value in L2. That will give us our dividends paid, our net income times our payout ratio. And if it's false, I want it to display the text that says less than 10%. And you'll notice that I use quotation marks around the text to make sure that Excel knows that it is text. And so what should happen here, because this payout ratio is greater than 10%, it'll simply multiply our net income times our payout ratio. If we drag this formula down and fill it to the next row, we'll see that the payout ratio for the next company is less than 10%. So what we should expect is text that says less than 10%, and let's see if that's the case. And we see less than 10% in the instances where their payout ratio is less than 10%. So again, our if function allows us to return a value depending on some criteria. There is a logical test, and then we want the value if it's true, and we can use mathematical operators such as multiplication in each of these values. And we can also have it display text, but if we use text, then we need to make sure we use quotation marks.